Part 1. The Very Long Year Inside Noah's Ark.
Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into one of those stories that almost everyone has heard at least once, usually in a brightly colored children's book, with smiling giraffes, happy elephants, and a very tidy wooden boat floating peacefully on bright blue water. But tonight, we're going to slow that story down, way down. Because when you look closely at the timeline in the book of Genesis, something interesting appears. The flood didn't last 40 days the way the quick version often says. The entire experience, from the moment the door closed to the moment Noah finally stepped back onto dry land, lasted about 370 days, which means roughly one full year. A year inside a massive wooden structure with your family and thousands of animals, and not much else. So tonight, as always, dim the lights a little, get comfortable, maybe grab a blanket. Let the world slow down for a bit, because we're about to spend a very long, very quiet year aboard Noah's Ark with Noah and his extremely patient family. And honestly, patience was probably the most important survival skill anyone had on that boat. Let's begin before the rain, before the animals, before the door shuts. Picture a very old man building a very large boat nowhere near the ocean. According to the book of Genesis, Noah was about 600 years old when the flood began, which already tells us something about the world of early biblical storytelling. People were living extraordinarily long lives. Noah's grandfather, Methuselah, for example, famously reached 969 years. So Noah, at 600, was basically middle-aged, still spry enough to start a major construction project. The instructions he receives are oddly specific. God tells him to build an ark from gopher wood, a material scholars still debate today, and coat it inside and out with pitch. Think of it as ancient waterproofing, like a giant wooden box dipped in tar. The dimensions are clearly given: 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits tall. Depending on how you translate cubits, that's roughly 135 meters long. So imagine something about the length of a modern cargo ship built entirely out of wood by a man who probably didn't have power tools, and importantly, built far from any sea, which must have been an interesting conversation starter with the neighbors. Picture the locals wandering by. "Hey Noah, what's the giant boat for?" And Noah calmly saying something like, "Global flood," which probably ended the conversation pretty quickly. But eventually, after years of building, the ark stands finished. A massive rectangular vessel with 3 decks, a single window near the roof, and one very large door. Then comes the part that children's books love: the animals. Pairs begin arriving, 2 of every kind of land animal, birds, creatures that crawl, livestock, wild animals. And if you imagine the scene slowly, it becomes a little surreal. Lions walking beside gazelles, wolves beside sheep, elephants lumbering up wooden ramps, snakes quietly sliding into dark corners, and Noah's family trying to organize all of this. Because Noah doesn't board the ark alone. With him are his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives, plus Noah's own wife, who remains unnamed in the biblical text, which feels a little unfair considering the circumstances she's about to endure. So 8 humans total, 8 people managing an entire floating zoo. Now imagine the logistical moment when all these animals are inside. Food must be stored, pens arranged, walking space planned. Because once the door closes, there is no stepping outside for fresh air. And eventually, the final detail occurs. According to the text, God himself shuts the door, which is both comforting and slightly terrifying, because once that door closes, there is no turning back. And then the rain begins. At first, it probably feels ordinary. Rain was not unknown in the ancient world. Storms happen. But the rain keeps falling, hour after hour, day after day. According to the book of Genesis, the rain continues for 40 days and 40 nights, which sounds manageable when summarized quickly. But if you imagine the slow reality, 40 full days of constant rainfall, the sound alone would be incredible. Rain hammering the roof, wind pushing against the wooden walls.
Water sloshing beneath the hull as the ark slowly lifts from the ground. And somewhere inside, animals adjusting to their new environment. Now here is an important detail. The rain isn't the only source of water. Genesis also mentions the fountains of the great deep bursting open, which ancient readers imagined as underground oceans erupting upward. So water is coming from above and from below. And eventually, the ark begins to float. And at this moment, life inside the ark truly begins, because once the ark lifts off the ground, the next 370 days are basically one long floating routine. Let's imagine an ordinary morning on the ark. There is no sunrise visible through large windows. The ark only has a small opening near the roof. Light filters down in dim shafts. The air smells like hay, damp wood, and animals. Lots of animals. Noah wakes up first, or maybe he never slept very well in the first place. He climbs down the wooden ladder between decks, checking pens and food storage. Some animals are quiet. Others are already awake. Goats bleating, birds rustling. Somewhere, a donkey expressing its feelings very loudly. Breakfast probably involved distributing grain, fruit, dried plants, and whatever else Noah had packed for the journey, which must have required enormous planning, because feeding animals for a full year is not a casual grocery trip. Elephants alone eat hundreds of pounds of vegetation per day. Now imagine that multiplied by every species on board. So the ark's lower decks were likely packed with supplies, barrels, bundles of hay, baskets of grain, dried figs, maybe salted foods. And the family probably developed a routine quickly. Morning feeding, cleaning pens, refilling water containers, checking the structural beams, and of course, removing waste, which is the part that children's storybooks politely skip. But realistically, someone had that job every day for a year. Let's just say Noah's sons probably got very familiar with shovels. Outside the ark, the world continues disappearing underwater. Genesis says the waters prevail for 150 days. That's 5 months. 5 months where the ark simply floats. No land, no trees, no mountains, just water stretching endlessly to the horizon. Inside the ark, time becomes strange. Days blur together. You feed the animals, clean, sleep, repeat, again and again and again. It's not hard to imagine moments of quiet frustration. 8 humans sharing the same confined space for months. No privacy, no vacations, no, I'm going outside for a walk. Even the calmest family might eventually needing personal space. But the ark offers very little of that, which means Noah's family likely developed the ancient survival strategy known as strategic silence. Sometimes the best way to survive a long journey with relatives is simply not talking for a while. And meanwhile, the animals continue living their own slow rhythms. Lions sleeping for long hours, birds fluttering occasionally, rodents quietly chewing through stored grains if Noah wasn't careful. And somewhere in the middle of all this, the ark creaks, wood expanding and shifting as waves push against it. But remarkably, it holds together, month after month, a giant floating box riding out the largest flood in biblical history. Eventually, something changes. After 150 days, the waters begin to recede. Not dramatically, not with a sudden reveal of land, but slowly, almost lazily. Genesis describes the ark coming to rest on Mount Ararat, which is part of a mountain range located in what is today Turkey. Now here's the interesting part. Even though the ark touches ground, Noah doesn't immediately leave. In fact, months pass before anyone steps outside, because although the ark has landed, the world is still flooded. Mountaintops begin appearing first, small patches of land rising above the water, but the earth is still soaked, mud everywhere, and Noah is nothing if not cautious. So instead of rushing out, he waits and waits and waits, until one day he decides to run a small experiment. He releases a bird, a raven. The bird flies out through the window into the wide, empty sky, and for the first time in months, something leaves the ark. What happens next we'll gently float into in the next part of the story, because the final months aboard Noah's Ark are surprisingly quiet and oddly patient. No dramatic escapes, no rushing celebrations, just an old man, a floating zoo, and the slow return of dry land. But for now, the ark rests quietly on a distant mountain. The rain has stopped, the animals are fed, and Noah probably looks out that tiny window, wondering how much longer this very long year will last. And honestly, after nearly 12 months on a boat full of animals, stepping onto solid ground must have felt like the greatest luxury in human history. So settle in, because our slow journey through the ark's final days is just beginning, and we still have quite a bit of quiet floating left to do.
Part 2. The birds, the waiting, and the slow return of dry land.
All right, let's gently drift back to the ark. The rain has stopped now. Not recently, not dramatically, just somewhere in the past. The endless drumming on the roof has faded into memory, replaced by a quieter sound, water shifting slowly around the wooden hull. Inside Noah's Ark, life has settled into a rhythm that is almost normal, which is a strange word to use for a floating wooden zoo containing 2 of every creature. But humans are very good at adapting to routines, even bizarre ones. Wake up, feed animals, clean stalls, check supplies, sleep, repeat, day after day. By now, Noah and his family probably move through the ark almost automatically. They know which boards creak, which animals wake early, which corner smells a little worse than the others. And importantly, the ark is no longer drifting. At some point during those long months, it came to rest on the mountains of Mount Ararat, in the region that today sits within Turkey. But even though the ark is grounded, the world outside is still mostly water. So the waiting continues, which is something Noah seems remarkably comfortable with. Patience, it turns out, may be the quiet theme of this entire story. Let's imagine one of these late mornings. Light is filtering down from the small opening near the roof. Not bright, just enough to give the wooden interior a soft gray glow. The animals are calmer now. At first, months earlier, they must have been restless, confused, perhaps even a little panicked by the strange confinement and constant motion. But animals adapt quickly. The lions have found comfortable corners, the birds hop along wooden beams, the sheep, well, sheep mostly continue being sheep. And somewhere nearby, a goat is probably chewing something it shouldn't. Noah climbs the ladder toward the ark's window. This is one of the few connections to the outside world, a small opening under the roofline. Not exactly a balcony view, but enough to see the sky. And after months of gray rain clouds, the sky now looks different, clearer, wider, quiet. So Noah decides to try something, a small experiment. A reconnaissance mission, you might say. he releases a bird, a raven. Now, ravens are interesting birds. They're clever, curious, adaptable, which makes them a reasonable choice for exploring a strange new landscape that might still be mostly water. The raven flies out of the ark's window and disappears into the open sky. Inside the ark, everyone waits. It must feel oddly quiet. After months of hearing nothing but animals and family members, the sudden absence of one small creature becomes noticeable. But the raven does not return immediately. In fact, according to Book of Genesis, the raven begins flying back and forth, circling the world outside, landing on floating debris, exploring patches of emerging land. Ravens are scavengers, after all. If anything edible is floating around the remains of the old world, a raven will eventually find it. So the bird keeps flying, returning sometimes, leaving again, which tells Noah something important. There are still places for birds to land out there, but perhaps not enough dry land for the humans to safely leave. So Noah tries another bird, this time a dove. Now, the dove is a very different kind of bird, gentler, more delicate, less interested in scavenging floating wreckage, which makes it an excellent indicator of dry land. If the dove finds somewhere comfortable to perch, somewhere with vegetation, somewhere peaceful, then maybe the world is finally ready again. So Noah opens the window and releases the dove. The small bird flutters out into the open sky. For a while, nothing happens. Inside the ark, Noah and his family wait again, and waiting, by this point, has become their specialty. But eventually, the dove returns, and when it does, it brings nothing. No leaves, no twigs, no sign of dry ground.
Just a tired little bird that has found nowhere to rest except the ark itself. So Noah gently brings it back inside, and the waiting continues. 7 days pass. 7 more days of feeding animals, cleaning stalls, listening to the quiet creak of wood against drying earth. And after those 7 days, Noah releases the dove again. Out it flies, into a world that is slowly recovering from water. Time passes. Then the dove returns. But this time, something is different. In its beak is a small olive leaf. Just a single green leaf. A tiny piece of life from the outside world, which means something extraordinary. Somewhere out there, an olive tree has emerged from the floodwaters, and it has leaves, real, living vegetation. For Noah and his family, this must have felt like the most encouraging sign imaginable. Not dramatic, not loud, just a small green leaf carried gently through the ark's window. Proof that the earth is beginning again. So, naturally, Noah waits another 7 days, because at this point, patience has clearly worked well for him. 7 days later, he releases the dove one final time. The bird flies out into a world that is now probably filled with muddy hillsides, scattered pools of water, and the slow return of sunlight. And this time, the dove does not come back, which tells Noah everything he needs to know. The earth has become livable again. Somewhere out there, trees stand tall enough for birds to rest. The world has begun healing. But interestingly, Noah still does not leave the ark immediately, even after the dove's departure. Instead, he removes part of the ark's covering. For the first time in months, the interior opens more fully to the outside air. Fresh wind enters, light pours down across the wooden decks,
Animals blink and shift as sunlight reaches places it hasn't touched for nearly a year. And Noah looks out across the land. The floodwaters have receded. The ground is visible, but the soil is still drying. So once again, he waits. Because after surviving nearly 370 days inside Noah's Ark, rushing the final step probably feels unnecessary. At this point, what's a few more weeks? Let's imagine those final quiet days. The Ark is still resting on Mount Ararat. The air coming through the open roof smells fresh, clean, different from the dense mixture of hay and animals that filled the Ark for months. The animals are restless. Birds flutter more frequently. Some creatures probably sense the outside world returning. And Noah's family, after living inside the same wooden structure for an entire year, must be thinking about the simple joy of walking. Just walking. Stretching their legs across solid ground, feeling dirt under their feet instead of wooden planks. But they wait until finally the instruction arrives. God tells Noah that the time has come. Open the ark, let everything out, and begin again. Which means that very soon the doors of the ark will swing open. Thousands of animals will step back into the world, and Noah's long floating year will finally come to an end. But before that moment arrives, there is one last quiet morning aboard the ark, one final routine, one final feeding of animals, one last glance across the decks that carried them safely through the greatest flood in the story of the book of Genesis. And after all that time, after all that waiting, the outside world is finally ready. And in the next part, we'll slowly step outside with Noah and watch the strange, muddy, newly washed earth welcome life back again.